In those dark, early days of World War II, just after Pearl Harbor, America was on the ropes. It needed a win, badly. What it got instead was one of the most daring, some would say craziest, gambles in military history. We're talking about the Doolittle Raid, a mission born from sheer desperation that would go on to change the psychology of the entire war.
And it all kicks off with a really weird mystery. Imagine you're a sailor on the USS Enterprise in April of 1942. You look across the water, and you see something that it doesn't compute. It's something that just breaks all the rules of how things are supposed to work at sea.
So the story really gets going when the crew of the Enterprise spots its sister ship, the USS Hornet, sailing right alongside them. But there was something really off about the Hornet's deck. It just didn't look right.
What they were seeing were these huge, clunky airplanes packed onto the flight deck. Now, these weren't the usual Navy planes they were used to seeing. No, these were massive, twin-engine Army B-25 bombers rocking Army camouflage sitting on a Navy carrier. It made absolutely zero sense.
So what on earth was going on? Well, this was the beginning of an unbelievably audacious plan. This was a direct and very personal response to the attack on Pearl Harbor that had happened just a few months before. This was going to be America's answer.
So, the plan had two main goals. The official objective, the one on paper, was to hit factories and military sites in Tokyo and a few other Japanese cities. But the real goal? That was all psychological. The idea was to prove to the Japanese people, and more importantly their leaders, that their homeland was not untouchable.
And the guy they picked to lead this incredible mission was none other than the legendary aviator Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle. The plane he and his men would be trusting with their lives? The North American B-25 Mitchell bomber.
Okay, so why this plane, specifically? I mean, there were other bombers that had way more range. Well, it all came down to one critical detail. The B-25 had a pretty small wingspan for its size. And that little fact was the key that let the Navy cram 16 of them, practically wingtip to wingtip, onto the Hornet's flight deck.
The strategy itself was basically a one-way trip. See, these B-25s, they were way too big to ever land back on the carrier. So the plan was for the Hornet to sneak them to within about 400 miles of Japan. The bombers would take off, hit their targets, and then keep flying on to land in friendly parts of China. Sounds pretty straightforward, right?
Well, yeah, not so much. Because as you know, in any war, the plan almost never survives first contact with the enemy. And for the Doolittle raid, that first contact came way, way too early, and it put the entire mission and the lives of every single person involved in serious jeopardy.
The American fleet, sailing under total radio silence, was spotted. And not by a big destroyer or a warship, but by a little Japanese patrol boat, a picket boat too small for the ship's radar to even pick up. And just like that, the element of surprise, poof, it was gone.
This one tiny encounter created a brand new and very deadly problem for the mission. They had to launch immediately, right then and there, before that patrol boat could radio their position back to Japan. But that meant launching from 650 miles out. That's an extra 250 miles of ocean they absolutely did not have the fuel for.
This is the crucial moment. The mission suddenly went from being incredibly risky to basically a suicide run. If they went forward, the bombers were almost guaranteed to run out of fuel long before they reached the safety of the Chinese airfields. The smart play, the logical choice, was to turn back.
But they didn't turn back. Doolittle and his men, they made the call. The risk to the carriers was too big if they stuck around. And the mission, well, it was just too important for morale back home. So they decided they were going to go anyway.
So that brings us to the launch itself. And what they were about to try was, well, it was something that had literally never been done before. This would become one of the most tense, nail-biting moments in the history of aviation.
You have to understand, a B-25 was never ever designed to take off from an aircraft carrier. It's a bomber. It needs a long runway. And here, they had less than 500 feet of pitching rolling deck. The carrier had to steam full speed into the wind, and the pilots had to time their launch perfectly with the bow of the ship rising on a wave, just to get enough lift. If they messed it up by a split second, they just dropped right into the freezing Pacific.
And if that wasn't hard enough, the planes were dangerously overweight. They'd stripped out everything they could, like some of the guns, to save weight, but then they loaded them up with extra fuel tanks and 2,000 pounds of bombs. And Doolittle, the leader, he went first, giving himself the absolute shortest runway of all, just to prove to his men that it could be done.
Against all odds, every single one of those 16 bombers wrestled its way into the air. And a few hours later, they appeared in the skies over Japan, dropping their bombs on a nation that was totally shocked and completely unprepared. Then they turned toward China.
But that fuel problem, it was very real. As their tanks ran dry over China, one by one, the crews had to make a terrible choice. Either bail out into the darkness or try to crash land their plane. Amazingly, most of the men actually survived, but 3 died in the crashes, and 8 were captured by the Japanese.
Now, if you look at it purely from a military destruction point of view, the Doolittle raid didn't accomplish much. The physical damage was pretty minimal, really. But its true impact, you couldn't measure that in collapsed buildings. You had to measure it in shattered confidence.
For the folks back in the United States who had heard nothing but bad news since Pearl Harbor, this was absolutely electrifying. The news that American bombers had hit the very heart of the Japanese Empire. It was a huge shot in the arm. It was a clear signal that America was in the fight, and it could and would hit back hard.
And for Japan, the raid was a profound shock to their system. It completely shattered the myth that their home islands were sacred, that they were untouchable. It proved to their leaders and their people that, as one American pilot later said, "We could reach out and we can touch you." This one event actually forced Japan to completely rethink its entire war strategy.
And that leaves us with this fascinating question, right? Here you have a mission that by pretty much any tactical measure was a failure. Yet it became a strategic masterpiece. It was this incredible, audacious gamble that paid off, not with land or resources, but with the one thing that can actually change the course of a war: hope.